Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second panel within the online conference Journalists as Targets of Hate that the SEENPM is organizing with IFEX. In the following 50 minutes, we will be talking about how to navigate hateful environments and what are the consequences for journalists' safety and independence. My name is Elvira Jukić-Mujkić, and I'm coming from Mediacentar Sarajevo, and it is my pleasure to welcome my colleagues from Serbia, Kosovo, and North Macedonia, who will give us more insight and their personal experiences in this regard. Please leave your questions and comments in the chat and the Q&A section, and we are happy to take them later. But first, let's hear our panelists. Our keynote speaker for this panel is Jovana Gligorijević, journalist and editor from Vreme weekly from Serbia. We will then hear from Una Hajdari, journalist from Kosovo, working both with in the region and with international media, and our colleague from North Macedonia, Miroslava Byrns, from daily Sloboden Pečat. All three of our colleagues have a lot to share with us today. Beginning with Jovana, I will ask all of them to use 10 minutes each and let us know about your experiences with hateful environments and how does this affect your work and the work of your colleagues. And later we will have some time for the discussion and of course for the questions of our people who are following us. So Jovana, please go ahead.
Thank you, Elvira. So first, I would really like to say thank you to Nazan and Natasha for sharing their personal experiences on the first panel. And secondly, I would like to, ask you to pay attention or at least take a look at a report published by UNESCO this spring. It's named Chilling: Global Trends in Online Violence Against Women Journalists, that actually draws on a survey of 901 journalists from 125 countries worldwide. And although it was anonymous, I feel safe enough to say that I was one of 901 female journalists that were interviewed for the needs of this survey. But I would also like to say a few things about my personal experience. So basically in the past, well, let's say 8 years, I have experienced different forms of both hate speech and violence. So I will just point out some of those attacks. So my home address was published on YouTube comment section actually, and when I reported it, our special prosecutor for IT crimes in Serbia gave me legal advice to contact Google support as if I don't know it as a journalist. So my address was already taken down because other people reported it before I even found out that this happened. The other thing is that we have websites. Natasha mentioned it on the previous panel. We have a website established only for defamation that publish details not only about me, but about my family, actually my parents, putting them in really misleading context that was dangerous not only for me, but really, really dangerous for their safety. And in the past years, I have received and reported so many death and rape threats that I really have stopped counting. And at some point, I stopped reporting it to both police and prosecution, because here in Serbia, we do have a special mechanism for journalists. I would like to just say one sentence about the context in which I receive threats. The problem is that I do write about interior politics in Serbia, but I do write a lot about not only female rights, but violence against women, which triggers some circles in the society, in every society, but here we speak specifically about Serbia. So a year ago, it culminated with, let's say, credible death threats, which at first I really didn't want to report, but my editor and people close to me strongly advised me and practically insisted, so I did it. And there is a good news, actually, in terms of impunity. At the beginning of this month, the perpetrator was sentenced. So I was in the same courtroom with him, of course. But the interesting thing was that I couldn't force myself to look at him. And I was not afraid at that point, but I was really overwhelmed with guilt because I knew that he is going to be pronounced guilty. And I was overwhelmed with guilt and some weird sort of empathy for him. The problem is that Serbian employers, most of them, require clean criminal records if they want to employ someone. So all I was thinking about was, what if he applies for a job and gets rejected because of me? Was this really worth it? Was his threat really that serious? Was I really that afraid of him? And why couldn't I just suck it up and continue with my life and, of course, with my job? But I mentioned this report at the beginning because then, when he was sentenced, I looked back at this report, and that was an eye-opening experience for me because it was like I'm reading it for the first time. So I have already known that my experience, my personal experience, is far from the worst. But what I figured out that it was a textbook example of targeted harassment. So what I did not know also is that my reaction was also a characteristic pattern that we do not talk about enough within media community, and that's something that I would really like to point out on today's session. So there are several details about this UNESCO report that I would like to point out. One of them is that online threats and attacks are highly damaging to women. I believe also that it's also damaging for men, but this report is specifically focused on female journalists. So it's damaging both for their careers and health. And there is data that says that 1 in 10 had sought medical or psychological help after being targeted. And 1 in 3 has started self-censoring. And I have to admit that I am 1 of 10. I had to ask for psychological help, which helped me to figure out that I have internalized hatred that was directed towards me. And I was really in early stages of self-hatred. And fortunately, since I asked for help in the early stages, I had a chance and successfully recovered from that and stopped that, let's say, toxic pattern of thinking about yourself or myself. The report also says that online threats and attacks actually that there's a large portion reported, a large portion of interviews, women journalists reported a professional impact from the attacks, with 2% of those who decided to leave journalism forever. And I also have to say that I do consider leaving journalism exclusively for this reason, because it really becomes overwhelming. And I do have thoroughly developed plan B, not if, but when I decide to leave journalism. The report also says that there's nothing virtual about online violence, because it has become the new front line in journalism safety, and women journalists sit at the epicenter of the risk, because the report mentions cases of female journalists in Turkey and United States, where some groups online did publish their home addresses, and those groups actually came to their homes, and their homes were attacked. So what this report also detailed is how how the online violence is increasingly spilling offline. And here I would like to add something about the impunity. I have mentioned this one person that was sentenced practically in the first week of June this month. Well, actually, it is already last month. So the only person, he is the only person that was ever sentenced that I have reported for endangerment of my safety. And the interesting thing is that he's the only person I have reported that is not connected with any political group or party in Serbia, which is quite indicative for me personally. Of course, the report that I have mentioned analyzed multiple forms of online violence, including threats of sexual and physical violence, harassing private messages, which I did report, that there are coordinated dogpile attacks from large groups, hacking and doxing. And I have experienced all of these practically. So as a result of the exposure of personal details, a number of journalists actually had to move home or even country. And I have to admit that I was lucky that I don't own any. I don't own my apartment, so I did move several times for the reasons that I have already mentioned. Sorry. So what the report also covers is are less well-known forms of the attacks, including misrepresentation through spoof accounts or fake content. I had to deal with fake content, and I believe that the threats that I received in May last year are in direct connection with manipulations and fake print screens and screenshots of tweets that I have never tweeted. So I really believe that that was the reason. And the report also says, what I know from my personal experience is that social media platforms are the main forum for online violence against women, and have, I will quote this, so far failed to respond quickly or effectively to the crisis. I really have to strongly agree with this. I faced with practically stealing of identity on social media that came from the person that I already reported for stalking, because I was receiving messages, emails. That person showed up near my newsroom, but prosecution figured out or concluded, whatever, that they cannot prove that this is the clear case of stalking.
Jovana,
Yes.
thank you very much for now. I would suggest that we move on just to.
Okay, I would just like to
Sure.
just to close it. So what my point is that we do not talk enough about this because we insist on professionalism. We open only on the sessions like this, and we never address it the way we address the issues that we write about as journalists. So I really wanted in this keynote session to ask, in a nutshell, do we stick to journalism standards when we speak about violence towards journalists? So that's it from me, and thank you.
Thank you, Jovana. Thank you for sharing all these very personal experiences and actually showing us how is it that hateful narratives are actually affecting your work as a journalist in the region. And thank you for sharing the idea of having a plan B. It's not easy to kind of listen to about it, and I cannot just imagine how is it for you. But let's hear it now. I'm sure we will get back to that later within the questions. Let's go. Let's move on to Una Hajdari. Una, what are your experiences? Probably a bit similar and in another way different than Jovana's, but more or less there are kind of affections to your work as a journalist, especially as a female journalist in the region. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Elvira, and thank you, Jovana, for that very enlightening presentation. Again, not going to repeat repeat points that Jovana made already about the situation in Serbia and how it affects journalists. I agree with them, obviously, in full. One big difference that I thought would exist that I would like to highlight is the one I always believed that I was a bit more protected from targeted harassment online and as a journalist, because I tend to focus publish most of my work in foreign English language outlets, which means that the head of a political party or an employer of someone in my family can't call my editor, which sometimes happens, sadly, in some places a bit more often. Can't call like my paper or my outlet and tell them to, tell her to stop publishing this, writing this. So I thought I was more protected because there was this, political interests were not as easy, could not as easily affect my work. However, that doesn't entirely protect you from the individual, from targeting from individuals in society. So I would say that just like Jovana, usually is the topic that you cover that attracts most of the ire online. In my case, I've written, well, first of all, I cover Kosovo and Serbia, and that's just enough. But then the relationship between Kosovo and Serbia. But I also cover far-right groups and nationalist groups, nationalist tendencies across the entire region. This has led to people having very angry and intense opinions about me, and the thing that we can all agree on is that obviously these people aren't targeting us journalists because they want to have a healthy debate about the quality of our reporting. But so they usually target, the targeting comes in the form of those who don't want to engage constructively in any way. My worst experiences have been with diaspora communities, diaspora outlets, diaspora, people who have, again, like Jovana said, multiple sort of ghost accounts and stuff that they use to target journalists. And I've had the most difficult time dealing with them. This has made it harder to also report them. Unlike some of the cases that Jovana mentioned, I can't really go to the office for that deals with online harassment and stuff like that, and have them find the person and charge them because this person lives in Australia or lives in the US or lives in Canada. And that is one of the major hurdles on my end when it comes to targeting online. But these people can't threaten me in person, perhaps, as Jovana has mentioned, but they have a strong influence on first of all your sense of self-worth as a journalist, but also on other communities locally. So they are usually the first people to react to your articles, and then they rile up locals who are who might not be as intense online but are more prone to reacting. And I don't have anything very sort of very sage advice on how to deal with that. Mainly the thing that helps the most is, again, other journalists reacting, and sort of when you show that there's a sense of a community out there of people supporting the journalist who's being targeted, they are then also really often discouraged from repeating them. Also blocking helps, but they tend to make other accounts and try to get involved differently. Just two more points I'd like to make briefly, just so we have more time for questions that I can answer specific things. I'm one of those journalists who doesn't like talking about herself very much. So at panels, I like asking people questions. So I already have questions of my own for Jovana. But I just briefly would like to say one thing that has made it, for me, more difficult to report from Serbia versus some other countries in the region I mean, I currently live in Belgrade, and I work out of Belgrade, and I enjoy living there, and I mean, love living there, and all that. But is the fact that the tabloid culture is so atrocious, and I have, and it's not just me. Obviously, I think it's like I've only been in the tabloids twice or something, for pretty disgusting things, for pretty baseless things, but people like Jovana and our other colleagues face that on a sadly much more frequent basis. With that, it's helped to have international watchdogs. I used to work for Reporters Without Borders for a long time, and as a monitor, one of the monitors in the region, and when there are reactions from these organizations, then that would also help in quelling sort of the targeted harassment that happens in tabloid culture. So yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you, Una. Thank you very much for this point about diaspora audiences and media outlets. That's a very specific topic, and we could talk a lot about it, definitely. Let's hear now from Miroslava. Miroslava, please share your experiences. Have you had similar experiences? Do you know about colleagues who have had similar experience, and how is this actually affecting everyday work that you do?
And thank you for having me. I think now in the beginning, we would all agree that when a journalist is free to express what the findings of his or her investigation are in a manner that is unaffected by censorship or auto-censorship, then the goal of journalism is fulfilled. The public is informed in a way which is truthful, and the personal feeling of the journalist is professional satisfaction and fulfillment. But unfortunately, we don't always work in these conditions. And there are times when this is not possible. It is not possible to focus on the professional career when you or somebody that you love is threatened with their life or safety. Besides the economical issues of journalists that can really become an obstacle in the prevention of the professional standards, the lack of safety is also a matter which is higher on the scale, which promotes censorship and self-censorship. It is especially important to note that when a journalist does not face the support of the community, the support of the newsroom, the public institutions, and feels as if he or she is left on his or her own, then auto-censorship is inevitable. And this in particular is the goal of those who threaten the journalists. They know very well that the strategy of threat and violence works well for the unprotected. But when society stands on the side of the harassed and the threatened, and when the police is doing their job in finding the perpetrators of hate crimes against journalists, as well as crimes against safety, then the society sends a strong message and signal to the violators that this is not tolerable and this is a matter of punishment. Unfortunately, in 2020, in my experience during the pandemic and when I was reporting during the pandemic, my experience wasn't positive in the way that the national institutions in Republic of Macedonia answered to the death threats I received while reporting. To put this in context, in April 2020, there were very strict coronavirus protective measures in force. And since my field in which I report is health, I was very interested. This was my job to cover this. These protective measures included prohibition of events and public gatherings, among other things. And when I saw that there were multiple violators of these measures, I decided to start covering them by asking for help from the people, from the public. So in return, I granted the readers their anonymity, and I do so today according to the highest professional standards. I basically wrote on my Facebook profile for people to send me videos and photos of events such as weddings and other celebrations which were massively taking place during this time in order for me to expose them later on. I would then check the videos and after I would make sure that they were authentic and new, I would publish a story. One day, I received videos and pictures of a particular wedding. And after I published the videos and the pictures, and I contacted the official sources like the inspectorates, the inspectors that are supposed to control these events. And I received the confirmation that this had really happened. I published that this wedding had stopped after inspectors got inside of the restaurant and found the guests again, that the guests that were not that were not respecting the COVID protocols. The next thing I got were messages in my inbox from a group of people. Someone said he would find me, asked me if I was aware who were the people that were getting married. I had no idea who was getting married. And even if I did know, I wouldn't care because I was just exposing breaking of the law. It turned out that the wedding was of the son of the Macedonian ambassador in a foreign country. He did not make the wedding in this country where protocols were respected, but he broke the laws in his own country, which appointed him. The death threats for me ended up with the fact that the police granted me 24-hour protection. There were police vehicles in front of my door. I ended up changing locations during this time. The psychological pressure was immense since it was a family of a public official. And I was not expecting the police to do anything except to write a report on the case. The police had never informed me after this if they talked to the perpetrators, if they caught anyone. They told me that I could go ahead and conduct a private court case and sue the unknown guy, even though we all knew where these death threats came from. And the police informed me that they cannot act since the criminal code of Republic of Macedonia does not state journalists as public officials. In this case, in a case if a public official or a member of the government, a politician, is being harassed, or if he or she receives death threats, then the police and the prosecution are going after the perpetrator. If the attacked or harassed person is a journalist, he is left to deal with it alone, which costs a lot of time and money, and going after powerful people on top of doing your everyday job. I do not remember not one time a journalist being threatened or beaten and the police in Macedonia to have caught the perpetrator. This is a very clear message for anyone not liking our reporting to do whatever they please to us. After I received these death threats, the president of Macedonia and other politicians and all the journalist associations in my country in a statement condemned this event. But the legal consequences for the people who harassed me and threatened to kill me remain non-existent until today. Meaning, while the support remains verbal, the situation ad acta is unchanged. During 2020, the Journalist Federation in Macedonia registered 14 attacks against journalists. They consisted of physical attacks, threats, verbal attacks, death threats. Most of the cases were reported in the Ministry of Interior, but resulted in 0 people being behind bars. According to my recent briefing for the purpose of this conference with the Ministry of Justice of Macedonia, very soon there will be changes implemented in the laws about the ways that journalists are considered in the criminal code. Very soon, attacks on journalists will be treated as if they are public officials, meaning the public prosecution can open the cases without the journalist to have to file a private lawsuit. But the implementation of these changes in the criminal code will be critical for freedom of speech and press in Macedonia in the future. The changes of the criminal code are great, they're awesome, but I hope that they will be implemented in practice without any exceptions. And with the, also, you know, there will be situations, I suppose, where we are going to have to explain to judges what a threat is. That doesn't matter if it was sent in your inbox or if somebody met you in front of your building, and all of these unnecessary things that the justice system takes into consideration before starting the process.
Okay, Miroslava, thank you very much for now. I have to stop you, unfortunately, even though I know that it's a very important, actually, it's a very important point that you're making with the lack of support from institutions and lack of legal support to journalists, especially in times when you're attacked. And I would love to hear more about it later. I would ask now, Tihomir, do we have any questions from the audience that is following us before moving to our questions here? And yeah, you have to unmute yourself to let us know about the questions.
Thank you, Elvira. Thanks for reminding me of that. No, not at this point. Maybe later.
Thank you very much, Tihomir. I know, Una, that you had, you mentioned earlier that you have questions for Jovana. I would give you the floor to ask your questions before moving on to the questions that I prepared here.
My question for Jovana is how people often look at vocal journalists, especially female journalists in Serbia, but also the region, and are when their attacks happen, they are like, why don't you you know, stop being so public, or stop tweeting in general, or stop, you know, having Facebook statuses, or, you know, writing about certain things. And I mean, Jovana has definitely been one of those people who's not backed down after the threats that she received. Is there any, could you share more about your thinking on that, whether or not women should back down, women journalists especially should back down after they receive threats, and what the challenges have been?
Yeah, it is challenging. It does put you in high risk, but that would mean a defeat, a final admitting of personal and professional defeat, because what they do want is to silence you. And the thing is, you have mentioned that you cover nationalism, so I believe that you know how things are going with radical right in Serbia, and the fact is that we both have problems with them, and they are connected, but secretly connected with the state. And so what personally I think is that we need to be loud about it, and we are. So, but I also have to be honest, I do deactivate my Twitter account once in a while, but it's more on the basis of mental hygiene than fear or something like that. But I do actually do that. But sometimes you just can't afford to do this. At this point, as we speak, I'm in the situation where I cannot disconnect, because I have just published the story about sexual abuse of minors in one scientific institution. All of the girls I spoke with are anonymous, so I have to stay both online and present in media, which is exhausting and which I really don't like that much as one could think, but they are anonymous and I have to be there to explain both to the public via social media and via traditional media what's going on actually. So I'm aware that this falls somewhere between journalism and direct support to the victims of sexual abuse, but when it comes to the public, I don't see what else could we do at this point.
Jovana, thank you very much for answering to this very important question. I was about to ask something similar, actually, just to say that attack on female journalists is kind of a special entertainment these days. And especially when it comes to excellent and hardworking women in the media, and when in situations where attackers don't find any spot in the career or integrity of the journalist, and then it only remains that they attack them on the basis of them being a woman. And you mentioned earlier in your presentation at the beginning that of course, probably all of us read your recent excellent story about sexual assaults. And you mentioned at the beginning of this panel that that writing about violence against women kind of triggers new violence or attacks on you just because you're exposing violence against women. So, but I'm sure, and unfortunately, that you're not the only case of a woman journalist who's actually exposing problems and attacks on women that is triggering another layer of attacks on women. So, where do you see kind of
well, first of all, there are many other female journalists in Serbia who are under attack, and basically, I think that Una will agree. Our profession in Serbia is very feminine at the point, and women, female journalists are actually leading in the profession, both in investigative journalism, opinion journalism, you name it, all except management and editorial stuff. We are not majority there yet, but in journalism, in practicing journalism, we are. The issue is, if you cover violence towards women, you would expect that everyone will disagree with the socially unacceptable behavior and everything. And yes, in most of the cases, it is the case in majority. The problem is, if you are taking feminist perspective, if you are not talking about traditional role of a woman in the society, if there is, this is again another personal experience. If you spot state efforts to limit reproduction rights, you will be attacked as a journalist if you point out that is the limitation of reproductive rights of women. And then both ultra-right and, let's say, mainstream traditional or right, whatever, nationalists will attack you in many different ways and forms. And of course, since I'm both journalist and the editor, sometimes I do write opinion pieces, and that's what pushes the wrong buttons for them, because you can investigate, you can report, you can face them with fact, but if you say your own, your personal, professional, whatever opinion, that triggers them, and then you will be under the attack again. So that's the issue. That's the answer. If I understood your question, it was practically why. So I strongly believe that's why. So loud women with attitude, women with opinion, that's highly irritating and problematic, no matter what is the subject that they have opinion on.
Thank you, Jovana. I will go back to Miroslava now. You mentioned in your presentation earlier, in your speech earlier, that it is not possible to focus on your professional career when you are attacked, or when you are when somebody from your family or friends is under attack because of your work. So, isn't this this is definitely the purpose of all the attacks? But how do you navigate through this? Do you have any suggestion? I know you mentioned that it would be good to change the law, and there are some announcements that there would be law changes in North Macedonia. But aside of that, sometimes you have good laws, but they're not being implemented. So just having, I know it would be a step up for journalists, but how do you, aside of that, how do you navigate throughout your day as a journalist?
First of all, you must never stop talking. Do not stay quiet. If you stay quiet, that encourages those that attack you to think that they won the battle. Second of all, ask for professional help. Ask for help from the newsroom. I received immense help from my colleagues. Everybody stood behind me, and they basically made pressure for the entire situation to be taken seriously, not to stay quiet. And also, I believe that women oftentimes need to ask for psychological help from a professional that will put in perspective that what should I do in the future? How should I continue? I think a psychologist can really help with that. But even if I went to one, I would make sure that those who threatened me never find out, just out of protecting my own dignity, because there is a lot of stigma when a journalist visits this help. You know, they are going to say, we made her go to the psychiatrist, we managed our point. So whatever you do to protect your personal well-being after these attacks is allowed, but I would do it privately, definitely. And I would talk loudly that I was attacked, who the attackers were, that the government doesn't do anything about it. So I have this double method, let's say it. It is also, I believe it's very, very important that I had help from my editors, you know, to go to work and them to tell you, you know, we are happy that you did this story. It's not your fault. We are behind you. This kind of help, and the condemnation of attacks from your superiors is very, very encouraging.
Thank you very much, Miroslava. Actually, thinking about all the things that you said and the previous panel, the main question on today's conference is actually how to stay in the profession, how to not use your plan B. It's good to have a plan B, but how not to use it. Unfortunately, we don't have much time to discuss all the specific questions that we could talk a lot about this. And thank you for sharing these very important pieces of advice on how to kind of help yourself, strengthen yourself, and surround yourself with people who support you. And maybe it's a good way, it's a good choice for you to keep quiet about how do you kind of strengthen yourself, but be loud about how attacks are not good for you or for journalists in general. Jovana has something to add.
Just one sentence. It's a piece of advice from experts. Always talk to someone who is not neither journalist or in media business when you receive threats. If you are discussing your personal experience and your own feelings, always check it with somebody who is completely out of media, because journalists are really prone to normalizing all these things and to tell us this comes with job. No.
Thank you, Jovana. There is still time for all the people who are following us on Facebook and on Zoom to ask questions in the Q&A section and the chat. I know that Tihomir has one question for all of us here, and then we will slowly conclude this panel.
Thank you, Elvira. Just a very quick question to all three panelists. So obviously you often find yourself under this avalanche of hate speech coming towards you. That's your reality. How much of a consideration is it when you make your editorial decisions, you and your colleagues, your superiors, your editors, etc.? How often are you in a position, if we investigate this story, we should expect, hate speech, hateful reactions from this side, from that side, and we should take that into account, etc. What I'm really asking is how much of an impact on your editorial decisions or editorial behavior, as it were, does it really have? Who would like to start? Jovana, maybe you.
Well, so far, we do take it into consideration. We, let's say, just, note the option. We make mental note that this or that could happen, but we don't give up. We still resist the trap of self-censorship, but we do take this into consideration, and there's always an option. My editor, for example, always suggests, if I write something critical, that as at the moment the article is published, that I leave Belgrade and spend a few days at my parents' home, for example. We had cases like that, or if it tackles nationalists or ultra-right. But it's again somewhere between basic physical safety and maybe self-care, just to put yourself physically and mentally out of the whole situation that that will come, certainly.
Thank you, Jovana. Maybe Una now, right, Tihomir?
Yeah.
I would love to be able to say I never think about that. In an ideal world, I think, well, in an ideal world, there would be less a smaller need for journalists, so maybe that's a bit of the conundrum. But in an ideal situation, I would never think about this. I do think about it because I think the thing that affects it the most would be if I feel that a smaller story that could provoke reactions will prevent me from getting a bigger story that is more important. And by this, I don't mean like big political interviews or anything. I've really never been someone who's aimed for that. I don't see the benefit of interviewing politicians who will say exactly what they say on TV every day, and not be able to, or with pre-prepared questions and stuff like that. So, but if I don't know if I was doing a bigger investigation on a far right group or on refugees or on something that is sensitive long term and a smaller story could affect it, then I would definitely reconsider publishing it, which really isn't something I like doing or I do lightly, but it is something that affects the way I decide to report on certain things. And personal safety is a little, or personal, avoiding harassment is the least important of the factors that, that affects whether or not I'll go after a story. But I've just learned to now become psychologically prepared for it. Like, when it comes out. I get off my Twitter, you know, like Jovana said, I don't delete it because I have to be, again, cover news events. It's one of, especially during the pandemic, it's one of my main sources of information on many things in the region and wider. But I go off on the day that the story comes out or something, and yeah, and then stay away from. I always stay away from tabloids. It's funny, every single time I was in a tabloid, someone else sent me the story.
Thank you. Thank you, Una. And let's hear from Miroslava. Unfortunately, we don't have much time.
That's fine, I'm sorry.
Do you reconsider publishing something because of the threats that you received?
On me, it has quite the opposite effect. The more threats, the more I write about it.
Thank you for being very, very clear about this. And thank you, Tihomir, for this very important question for the end. And let's now take 5-minute break. Stay tuned. Thank you very much, Jovana, Una, and Miroslava. Let's now take a 5-minute break and stay tuned for the next session, and that is how to confront hate speech.